this is going. So yeah. All right. So yeah, let's get into it. So Matt, thanks for being here today. On the
Yeah.
So this podcast I started about 6 months ago, and one of the things I like to kind of ask a lot of people about is kind of how they came. It's particularly with people who have been successful in whatever it is they do. I like to kind of figure out sort of how they think about things, how they think about problems, how they think about moving forward. And one thing that always really attracted me to your style of training and your philosophy on health, fitness, and strength training is at the core of it, there's health and sustainability. Like that's huge because
Yeah.
you don't see that a lot. I mean, at least you
No.
see it from a handful of people, but not in mass. What
Yeah.
caused what I should say, like what caused you to prioritize that, or where did that come from?
Yeah. Well, it was pretty simple. So when I was a kid coming up, I had some gifts in the bench press, but it took me a long time to be good at deadlifts and squats.
Mm-hmm.
And I ran into a couple of all-time world record holder guys, namely Ed Cohen and Larry Pacifico, two of probably, if you're to count world championship titles, probably two of the best powerlifters to ever live. And they came up to me and said, hey, you can be a world record holder if you can train hard for the next 10 or 15 years. So they knew that I wasn't going to be that strong right out of the box.
Right.
Like some of these other guys. They knew that it was going to take me a lot of time and patience to get better.
Right.
So I knew that to last 10 or 15 years to get up to world record numbers, I was going to have to do it really smart and stay in it for the long game. And that's where all my training philosophy came into, okay, I can do this exercise today, but if it doesn't help me tomorrow, I don't want to do it. So I started to create a philosophy of longevity because I knew that there were going to be a lot of other guys. I mean, like say, for instance, in my 26-year, career of competing, I'll bet you I ran into 15 to 20 guys that were better than me physically, but they weren't able to outlast me. So I got stronger than they were.
Right.
You know what I mean? So
Absolutely.
I was one of those guys that didn't have, it's crazy because I have records, but I didn't have the genetics to be that strong. I had the smarts to get that strong with enough genetic potential that allowed me to do it as well. But the point is that I had to work longer and smarter than a lot of the other people to get that good because I just didn't have the genetic freakiness that some of the other dudes had. So my game was always about longevity and understanding that if I wanted to get up to the best I could be, I was going to have to take the long road because the short road wasn't going to allow me to do that.
Right. That's really cool. I mean, it kind of came from the start because you had advice from two greats that gave it to you like that.
Yeah.
Do you find that, I know like in a lot of combat sports, for instance, there is amongst kind of people who understand sort of the developmental progress of a fighter, they'll often see that, like what you'll see is that those years that it takes to get you pro and to get you good enough to compete, like they're not done right, they take everything out of you and you can have like the shortest run as a pro. Is that something that happens in powerlifting a lot? It's like a lack of sustainability in training.
I think it probably happens. It probably happens worse in powerlifting. And I'll say this why. Like I said, I don't have any direct experience. I've played around with some fighters before, but I'll tell you what the difference is that most people at the world class level that are attracted to powerlifting are immensely good, immensely fast. And I think that in fighting, especially MMA, you have to be so good at so many different types of fighting. Like you can't just be a good stand-up guy. You can't just be a good ground guy. You got to have so many other skills that I think that fighters tend to have a little bit of a longer career based on the fact they have to be good at many more things.
Right.
Whereas in powerlifting, yes, at the top level, it's complex, but at the end of the day, it's a barbell and weights and you lift it one way.
Right.
Now I don't train that way, but my point is the outcome is the same versus in fighting, everything can be different every fight. You might have some similarities, but in reality, one fight could be almost all ground, one fight could be almost all stand up. The squat bar is still going to be the squat bar. So I find that powerlifting is actually worse in what you're asking because of the fact that most people that are really good at it, they get good at being specifically good too fast. And then what ends up happening is it shortens their lifespan in the career of the lifting because they don't have a big enough base to build the top of the pyramid,
Right.
So that's what I found, is that fighters tend to have to be good at more things. So it increases their longevity, so to speak, if they're trained properly.
Right, right, definitely. A lot of fighters, they have the opportunity to sort of evolve as their careers go on too. They can sort of change their style to either take less damage or suit their, their bodies at that point in time. But yeah, I could see that being
Sure.
not so necessarily like an option in powerlifting.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. I mean, that's the thing. And I think a lot of the problem with powerlifting, unlike fighting, is that people tend to get bigger to lift more weight, and then eventually it becomes counterproductive because they become unhealthy.
Right.
So what ends up happening is that, yeah, you might put on 20 pounds of body weight to raise your bench press, but eventually that weight's going to start weighing on your health, and then your health goes backwards, and then your strength goes backwards.
Right.
So I think weight classes in fighting, you can't, there's nobody that's ever going to come out of MMA and weigh 300 pounds and be any good, because at that weight, it's just impossible to have that level of endurance.
Right.
Versus in powerlifting, you can weigh 350, 400 pounds because the output is very short and abrupt. But the problem is that if you weigh that much, then what's going to end up happening is you might be strong in your early to mid 30s, but then by the time you get to your late 30s, early 40s, your health has gone backwards, and now your strength falters. So the problem with powerlifting, especially at the heavier weight classes, is you have to balance health with longevity and with weighing heavier. And that's three things that don't really like to fall together. I mean, when you're weighing 300 plus pounds and trying to lift maximal weights, your body is really running on empty as far as health is concerned.
Right. Right. And so on that similar topic, do you find, I mean, because a lot of people who listen to this are involved in combat sports or other coaches. There's some people who are into powerlifting and strength sports. But for people who might not understand that, typically in powerlifting, and I would love to hear your take on it, because I have a lot of questions about training as it pertains to that too. But typically in powerlifting, people always seem to ask or say, the bigger you are, the better your leverage is, maybe the stronger you get. I mean, these are just general statements. These aren't necessarily true. Could you comment on any of these? Or I know you just said that sometimes when people get too big, the health falters and the strength falters. But where do you usually, how does that conversation with an athlete or yourself go? How big is too big?
Yeah.
When do you need to get bigger?
Where do you find the tipping? Where do you find the tipping point? The big thing that I've always been told is you have to raise your body weight as your bench press rises. And then once your deadlift starts to fall out, that's when you know your weight has become too high. Because then you get too thick in the midsection, you can't lean over to pick up the bar as easily, and now you're in a bad position on the deadlift. I always thought that based on the fact that I was naturally a good lifter with shorter arms. So my bench always came up easier than the other lifts. But then the deadlift, as I got bigger and thicker, because I already had shorter arms, it always made it a pain in the ass. So I don't know. I mean, I think the hard part is that for most athletes, I wouldn't look at it as a body weight per se. I'd look at it as a body fat percentage. If you get a guy that can put on 20 more pounds, but he only puts on 0.25% body fat, he probably needed to weigh that much.
Right.
Versus in powerlifting, it doesn't matter your body fat. So you have to find that tipping point. I would say that for athletes, you're going to be wanting to look more at body fat percentage and inflammation. And for powerlifters, you're going to want to look at when does the bench press no longer help the deadlift, right? Okay. As far as body weight's concerned. That's how I would say to look at it as a fighter or an athlete is if your body needs to gain weight, if you don't get slower and you don't really gain any body fat, you probably need to weigh that for your sport. Right.
That sounds like a great rule of thumb. So,
yeah, I mean, I'm not saying that's the end all be all because, everybody has different limitations, but, that would be what I would say is, as an athlete, focus more on body fat percentage, and as a powerlifter, focus more on what does it do to the other lifts. So if my bench press goes up 20, but my deadlift falls 50, then my body weight that I put on probably wasn't conducive for getting stronger.
Right. That makes a lot of sense. And a lot of times too, I feel like powerlifting and fighting are opposite. Fighters never like to eat enough. Powerlifters seem to always want to eat more. So
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah. Well, I think as we grow up, or as you evolve in your own sport, you start to realize in the beginning that the more body weight you gain, the stronger you get.
Mm-hmm.
But then there's a tipping point versus in fighting, you gain 15 pounds and go into the ring for 3 rounds. You're going to feel that 15 pounds real fast.
Right.
Versus in powerlifting, you don't ever feel the weight because you're only lifting something for maybe at most 10 seconds. So it's not like it's the extra body weight's going to weigh down on your GPP or your physical preparedness.
Mm-hmm.
Much more so in a fighter, you're going to have these extra body weight gains are definitely going to change the cardiovascular realm of what you're doing because of the fact you're carrying extra weight for an extended period of time.
Right. On that topic, while we're here, I'd love to get your opinion on, even in a general athletic sense, maybe specific to fighters, or even as it relates to powerlifting on GPP. So it's pretty well established in your protocols and a lot of other powerlifting protocols, kind of what that means. Do you feel, because I've heard people like Dave Tate say before that GPP for fighters or for certain athletes is the strength training because they get so much of the endurance already in their practice. Is that a way that you sort of look at your training or with other athletes? Because I know you've worked with football players, special forces, all manner of bodies, basically.
See, where I differ in that statement would be the fact that
Mm-hmm.
I think that us as lifters and us as athletes and us as tactical professionals, whether it be special forces or firemen,
mm-hmm.
what we need to really be focused on is our weaknesses and not categorizing things as fighting or lifting or this or that, right? If I got a fighter that comes in and he can, walk at a fast pace at like 3.4 miles an hour with a 100-pound weight vest on for 3 hours, I probably don't need to have his GPP higher.
Right.
If he can't squat 185,
mm-hmm.
then maybe I need to attack his maximal strength. So for me, the hard part is everybody wants to categorize things into fighting or lifting or this or that. I think what it really should be categorized in is where are my deficiencies and how do I raise those so that other things can shine? Because at the end of the day, you're only as good as your weakest link. And if GPP is your weak link, then yes, you need to train more of it. But if maximal strength, so I find that in powerlifting, maximal strength isn't the problem. Mm-hmm. It's more physical work capacity and the ability to create endurance and maintain health and fitness levels in order to still sustain a long career. I find in fighting, in other sports and tactical special forces units, is that their physical work capacity is really good, but their maximal strength and dynamic power is trash. So what they end up doing is they start to focus on the things they're good at because they like to ignore the things that they're deficient in. And that's us as human nature. We're taught in school, let's go focus on, what do you like and what are you good at? Let's focus on that. What we should be focusing on is our deficiencies, right? Absolutely. And that is a very big mental transition for most people, right? Mm-hmm. You watch in fighting, if a guy is really good at stand-up, he's going to avoid everything at all costs to go to the ground.
Right.
And a guy that's good to the ground is always going to try to get that guy to go to the ground.
Yeah, exactly.
Versus being so well-rounded that you don't care what part of the fight you're in. That's where you're going to be good at. And that's why it's funny because you watch MMA and you listen to when, what's his name? Joe Rogan was doing a lot of the announcing. And he's like, hey, this fighter's really been working on his stand-up game now, so that's not a weakness. And he's more balanced of a fighter now. See, but you don't hear powerlifters talking about that shit.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? You're like, hey, look, this guy's lost 6% body fat, and now he's not going to be tired when he goes to the deadlift, and now he's going to be able to pull a big weight. The point is I think instead of categorizing things into fighting and lifting and this and that, we categorize things into where are our deficiencies and what do we need to put most of our emphasis on. The key is some things in our body need to go into maintenance phases while others go into building phases. And I was never afraid to do that. If I felt like my rep strength was low, I worked on my reps. And if I felt like my max strength was low, I worked on my straining. And if I felt like my dynamic efforts needed more work, I put more emphasis on that. And the funny thing is having this transitional thought process allowed me to have a way longer career with little to no mileage. Right. Because if I only focused on certain things at certain times or balanced them, then my body got a high all around full circle amounts of contraction types, therefore never completely wore out one particular area.
Right. Where did that come from? I mean, where did you get that sort of perspective from? I mean, I know on my end, for instance, like when I was seeing certain things that weren't working, it was almost weirdly cosmic. That was when I met Charles Poliquin, and he taught me about structural imbalance
Yeah.
and these things like that. What caused you to
Yeah.
sort of get that, come to these, or figure these things out? Was it a lot of trial and error, or?
Yeah. For me, it was a ton of trial and error. I figured that out way before I met Charles. I met Charles in 2016.
You kind of cut out there, Matt. I'm sorry. You said you met Charles when? I'm sorry?
And I was already on the path of understanding that general physical work capacity for powerlifting was actually, it's okay. Yeah. When I met Charles, I already figured that stuff out. So, but I figured it out the long way. I had been playing with that stuff since like 2013, and I met Charles in 2016. I hadn't completely dialed it all the way in yet, but long story short is that mine was just trial and error, and I would try something else until I could figure out the path. And sometimes it was a fast, quick fix, and other times it took years.
Right.
But for me, it was pushing the envelope of my own physical capabilities, and that's why I think for strength coaches in general, I don't think you have to be a world record holder. I don't think you have to be the best in the world, but you definitely have to push your own boundaries, because half of the shit that I learned from trying to get stronger myself.
Right.
Because when you've maxed out sleep and you've maxed out nutrition and you've maxed out what you know in training, now you can truly play around with variables.
Mm-hmm.
And understand what works and what doesn't work. But in reality, as well as I do, when you train other people, you just can't control variables.
Right.
So
100%.
How do you know this the training cycle that got better, right?
Yes.
Yeah. How do you know that? Unless you're controlling yourself first. So yes, it's a small sample size, but at the end of the day, I think what gave me all this knowledge was I would figure something out in the gym and then go look for a book that said something about it. I didn't do it the other way around.
Right.
Mm-hmm. And then I felt like I had both ends of the spectrum of knowledge. I had the experience and the education.
Right. And speaking of the education, I know you have a master's degree. It's from Ball State, correct?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. What
so
led? I'm sorry. Go ahead.
No, that's when Dr. William Kramer and Dr. Costel and a lot of the pioneers of strength conditioning research were still at Ball State at one time. When I went to school there, it was a juggernaut of information. I mean, I don't think that any place has ever been that high level of putting out strength and research papers ever. So from 1996 to like 2004, Ball State was putting out papers literally left and right about strength training and recovery and biomechanics and all this stuff. They had all the right people in the right place at the right time. And the reason is because Ball State had contracts with NASA to study anti-gravity with astronauts. So they had an ass load of cash that they were able to bring in a lot of the best professors all over the world. We had Dr. Kwan that invented motion analysis there. So you're talking about the guys, and when they throw a baseball and it breaks down the vectors and all the pressures and all that, he invented those original machines that could measure that with video. So we had all these guys in one spot. So I was by far and away one of the luckiest students ever, and didn't even realize what I had, at the time.
That's crazy. So I was going to ask, that was my next question, is if you knew that was going on and that's why you went, or if you went just because.
Well, I did a little bit. So long story short, my mom was in charge of surgery at the local hospital. Mm-hmm. She had another nurse that worked with her, and her son was about 5-6 years older than me. Mm-hmm. And he was an accountant for the Colts. So the Indianapolis Colts, he was an accountant for, and he knew they had strength coaches. His name was John Torreen. Mm-hmm. And I was from a small town, so I didn't realize that these big football schools had strength coaches. I mean, the only people I'd ever seen train anybody with weights was like personal trainers at the Y. Right. So I had no clue that was even a job profession. So he gets me down there to do a job shadow for a couple of days. And John Torreen is the one that tells me that Ball State's one of the top schools in the world for strength conditioning. I'm like, holy shit, that's 3 minutes from my house.
Yeah.
And so that's where it started. But I had no clue that Ball State was heavily ranked and had all these great professors at one time. I had no idea.
Right. Wow. That's crazy. That's pretty cool. And around
But
that
you
time,
gotta remember,
mhm,
this was before the time of the internet. So where were you going to go look that up and find that out? You know what I mean? I mean,
right.
that's the thing is like, you just wouldn't have known. It's not like today where you could type in Ball State exercise science and it would pop up world renowned for this, this, and this. You would have no idea.
Right.
So
Exactly. Yeah. That reminds me too of in some ways of a story you told last year at the Arnold when you did the longevity seminar with Heath Evans and well, almost Mike O'Hearn.
yeah,
Yeah. And
yeah,
you
yeah.
and you told the story about how you went at some point, and please jump in at any point, you went in to go see Ed Cohn. It might have been the first time you met him. And he said to you, if you want to, you asked him like, how do I be like you essentially? How do I get to this point? And he said, you're going to have to set up your life also to be conducive to it. And you had said something like he had owned condos and rented them out. So really all he had to do was train and do some basic management each day. Um, I guess where I was going with that um, was that something that you sort of uh, aspired to, like from an early, or the reason I ask that is because, you know, people typically get out of college, they've got to go work, they got to go work hard. You know, it's not always conducive to great training right away unless you're really disciplined. What was
Sure.
Ed sort of your model, like coming out of college, or what was your goal sort of when you got to that point?
My goal was is that I was going to put in as much time as I needed to graduate my master's degree because I knew that would set up my future, or at least help my future. After that point, I told myself from 25 to 30, I was going to focus on nothing but being the strongest guy in the world. And I didn't care if that meant that I wasn't going to make enough money, if I
Mhm.
wasn't going to have some of the things I wasn't going to have, you know, like a new car or a nice house. I said that from 25 to 30, this is going to be my lifestyle, is going to be just getting strong as shit. And actually, what I felt like I was doing was I knew that I wanted to be a strength coach at a high level down the road. But I felt like this was going to ensure that I had the street credit and gain the respect of anybody that I trained, because I felt like if I'm not going to put myself into the gauntlet 100 miles an hour, and keep in mind, I already had a ton of USAPL national and American records. So I was already, for most people, I could have stopped and had more accolades than most people in lifting. My
Right.
thought process was I wanted to show people that an average guy from Indiana that came from basically white trash
Hmm.
and could step up to the ranks and be one of the top lifters in the world, but I had to do it smart.
Right.
So my thought process was I needed to be the strongest guy in the world so that down the road I had the street credit. And that was my thought process.
Hmm.
So what I did was I took jobs that worked around my training protocol, and I didn't care how much I made till I was 30, because I thought, well, if I have the master's degree and I have the records at the highest level, there's no other way I can improve my chances of being one of the
Right.
best in the world at my profession. So the problem was is that I went kind of into the monk situation of all I cared about was getting strong and experimenting on myself and the small amount of people that I was training, and then
Hmm.
I could gain a grasp of what I needed. So with that being in mind, I think what Eddie really drove home to me was the fact that if I wanted to be a great lifter, it wasn't about what I was going to put into the gym. It's
Hmm.
what was I going to do the other 23 hours, 22 hours a day. So
Hmm.
what I decided was is that my sleep revolved around training, my eating revolved around training, and my stress levels revolved around training, meaning that if something was too stressful, i.e. a relationship, or maybe I was in let's say like a family feud with my uncle, I just wouldn't go to fucking Christmas
Right.
because to me, it was like, I'm going to focus on what was important to me at that time. And I missed out on a lot of stuff with family and friends that I probably, looking back, I probably should not have done.
Hmm.
But at that time, it was the only way I knew how to deal with all that stuff. Is if something was a stressful situation, I just avoided it so it didn't affect my training.
Right. Right.
And so that's what Ed Cohen really drilled into my head is if anything affects your training, cut it loose. So
Right.
that way you can be the best you can be. Because in reality, you only have, no matter when you start, you only have maybe, if you're lucky, a 15-year window physically of being able to do insane things. And after that point, it's too late. No matter how smart you train, you're not going to be the person at 30 that you are at 45.
Right.
You know, you might still be able to be strong, but
Mhm.
to compete against the top in the world, you got a small window, you know?
Right.
So for me, I never wanted to look back at 45 and be like, oh, look at me, I have a nice house and I'm super successful. But all of my late 20s and early 30s, I dedicated towards a job versus seeing what I was physically capable of. To me, it wasn't worth it.
Right.
I knew that I could make money when I can't physically do what I can do when I'm 30.
Right.
So for me, it was just kind of putting all the dominoes in the right effect to where I felt confident with myself. And not everybody has to follow that thought process or thought pattern, but just for me to have that feeling that I have now where I feel like I've accomplished what I wanted to accomplish, that had to be done. So for a lot of people, they don't have that level of buy-in or that level of intensity. And I totally get it. I don't judge people for that. But for me to be satisfied with myself, I had to put myself into that position and give myself that level of responsibility to where when I turned 40, last October, I felt like, man, I've really done what I set out to do. And I'm comfortable. And there's a certain level of like a big relaxation breath I can let out every morning, realizing that I did everything I wanted to do and I left nothing in the tank.
Right.
And I think a lot of people, when they get into their 40s and 50s, they don't have that. They didn't sell completely the fuck out to do something as hard as they could do and see what they were accomplished of. And regardless of how far it gets you, at least you dropped everything you had and you gave everything you had to do it. And who cares how far you get? That's not the point. The point is that you sold out to yourself. And now for me, I can relax and put my energy into other people now. I don't have to be the strongest guy in the room anymore.
Right.
Because I did that. You know what I mean?
No, absolutely. I think that's thank you for sharing that. Because that's, I think, a really awesome perspective for a lot of people to hear, because you hear a lot of people like preach the message of going and chasing and doing it, but you're somebody who really walked the walk. Like you really were able to do all those things. And like, I think what's key too for a lot of younger guys is having the faith just to go do that. Cause some people won't, 25 to 30, they're shitting their pants if they're not going for the best job they can. But realizing that'll still be there for you at 30, you can still go chase.
Yeah. Oh, by far. And you'll be ready for it at 30, because the average 25, 30-year-old, if you give them a 6-figure job, they are going to waste that money on stupid shit.
Oh yeah.
You and I both know. If you're making $100,000 a year, you're going to go buy a brand new car every year. You're going to buy a house you probably can't afford. And now you're a slave to the money.
Yeah.
So I'd like people to know that from the age of 25, graduating with a graduate degree and already having all these records, I was making $35,000 or $40,000 a year for the next 6 to 8 years before I started making real money.
Yeah.
So I really didn't start making big money until I was 34, 35.
Right. Yeah. It's funny. I remember, that reminds me of a story when I was like 24 or 25. I had already been training jujitsu, and I was like just completely balls deep into going into learning all about fight sports, coaching and whatnot. And I remember I had to file my taxes that year, and I went to like H&R Block because I didn't know anything about how to do it. I'd only been out of college for like a year or two. And the lady looked at my tax return. I think I made like $16,000 that year or something. And she was like, she looked at me, she's like, honey, you need to make more money. And I was like, I know.
Yeah, don't worry about taxes. Yeah.
Yeah, like, please don't lecture me on this now. I get it. I'm broken, beat up, but I know what I'm doing. I know what I'm doing here. But that's what happens. Is like you get your eyes on that prize. I think for you, you had this really awesome convergence of like you said, that crazy luck at Ball State of having all those people there. You put yourself in the right situations to be around the right people to kind of bring out the best training in you as well. And for me, like I know on my end, I was lucky to intersect with a lot of great people in jiu-jitsu, a lot of great people in strength and conditioning as well. And while I didn't necessarily chase like strongest guy in the world, baddest fighter in the world or anything like that, I knew from a young age, kind of like you did too, it sounds like, that you wanted to get into coaching, that I knew that I was going to do that. And that was around the time too that I said, well, there seemed to be, and this is where I feel really lucky that I intersected with Charles, is that there was this sort of twilight generation of some of these great coaches who were sort of on their way out. And I was like, I need to go learn from these dudes. Like, I want to hear what they have to say. I want to, go travel to them. And I'm very fortunate I was able to do that with a lot of them. So it's really cool. So yeah, thanks for sharing all that.
Yeah, I mean, that's the thing is I think people just think, they see a guy like me and they're like, oh, this dude's a genetic freak, this guy, this and that, I mean, and a lot of other things too is you got to remember sometimes people that have the best cards dealt to them in life don't end up doing shit with it.
Right.
Like I think having that hard chip on my shoulder of grinding and having to work my way up has given me a completely different perspective on not only my value, but also, my time and all this other stuff that, I'm like, and the other thing is I don't put limitations on people. I'm like, look, if I can do it, anybody can do it. It's just, are you willing to step up or are you willing to lay down? I mean,
Right.
and the problem with most people, their ego won't let them step out of boundaries. And that's where I think the training style that I've kind of learned from Louis and Vogelpool and, all these great Russian and my old professors is the fact that I'm always looking for weak links. I'm always measuring myself and not doing it in a negative way, but always looking for the shortcomings and trying to fix and match and repair those versus just trying to focus on my strengths and hide everything. So guess what? I don't have an ego. Like
Right.
if I pick a lift that crushes me with something I think I should have got 200 pounds more with, so what? That's been my whole life, my whole thing. And I think that's really one of the big powers of training in the type of modalities and the ways that I do things is because you're always looking for weak links and you're always attacking the weak links. And when you think about your whole life perspective in that way, you're just a more rounded person, period.
Absolutely.
I mean, that's the thing is like conjugate training is only as smart as the hand that wields it. And the reason is because most people don't want to find their weaknesses and attack them and be open with them.
Right.
And I've been that way with my career. So I think that's what's really helped me out a ton.
Absolutely. That's a very martial arts sort of way of looking at it too. That's why I've always kind of liked the conjugate system. That's why anytime I see the Eastern texts or I see something that Louis would write back in the day, it's like, I knew it was about weaknesses. It was about sort of rounding yourself out more. And then like you just said, like being able to apply that to your life, that's even better,
Yeah. I mean, and that's the thing is that's why I like that cycle and that training modality is it's just really kept me honest with myself and kept me working hard toward things that are my deficiencies and doing it that way because that's what I do physically.
Right.
So it's easier to do it mentally. But I find that a lot of people that I train, especially like fire departments and things like that, you find these guys can and sometimes do have these massive egos of like, I want to wear a uniform and I want to be a cop or I want to be a fireman or I want to be a military guy, but you really deep down, you want all of the benefits with none of the work. Like
right.
you don't want to be super fit and be the strongest guy to show up on the scene. You want to slowly get fat and lazy and do all this other shit, and like, that's the other thing is you got to be really careful with is like, sometimes an ego will stop you from doing the shit you need to be doing because you don't want to show anybody your weaknesses.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? You don't want to show anybody that you can't bench anything or you can't deadlift any weight, like, it's like it hurts your ego. But for me, I'm always looking for ways to hurt my ego. You know what I mean?
Right. Exactly. Yeah. No, totally. I mean, that's why I came to train with you guys is I'm like, well, I know I can do this stuff, but I'm not strong. So let me go. I want to get strong and I want to learn from people who think about things the way like I think about, and that's not even an ego thing. It's just, I know that compatibility wise, it's there. That's why like I saw you and Rob.
Well, it's because you're like me. You will go out and seek people that have something you don't have, and you don't look at it as a downside. You look at it as an education process. You look at it as I'm going to make myself better by being around these people that are going to bring out my shortcomings. But you find that that's not a normal trait for most people. If you look at most people, they hide from shit they're bad at. They don't want people to see it. They don't, and that's a big problem in our society across the world is that we're not taught to accept our weaknesses and just work towards making them better.
Right. Definitely. Did that philosophy come from, did you start adopting that sort of before you met Louis or before you kind of were, or how did you get introduced to like conjugate based training? I should ask.
That's interesting. So Powerlifting USA used to be a really big magazine from like the 70s all the way up into, I think about 2009 is when I think it quit, somewhere around there. And I used to see these articles and keep in mind, my first couple of Powerlifting USAs, I was 16, 17 years old and I'm benching over 400 pounds. I'm one of the strongest guys ever in that high school. I have all the state records. So, I'm king shit in town. And I start opening up these books and I read these articles from a guy named Louis, and I start reading all this stuff on force and acceleration, and triceps need to be stronger to bench press. And when I grew up thinking the bench press was a pec exercise, and
right.
you know, your back needs to be stronger in order to press and all these things. And I'm like, holy shit, maybe I don't know what I'm talking about, because he's talking about all these guys that can bench 500 and 600 pounds.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm benching 400. And I'm thinking maybe there's something to this that I don't know, versus going, oh, this guy's full of shit. Look at me, you know?
Right,
so
right.
I was always intuitive to wanting my big thing was I just wanted to get better, period. And so I first met Louis right about the same time I started school. And I met him at the Arnold Classic.
Oh, wow.
And he was walking with Dave Tate and all the old school guys. And
Right.
I stopped him. I'm like, hey, man, what's going on? You know, and it's kind of like stopping like Sonny from like the Hills of Angels. Like 20 of them were around. They were all super big, strong guys. And I had the balls to go up and say hi to them.
Right.
And I go up and say hi to him. I'm like 19. And I shake his hand, like, hey, I'd like to come down and work out with you. And he asked me how strong I am. And he was fairly impressed with how strong I was with my age. And he's like, yeah, just come down sometime. And that was pretty much the end of the conversation. Well, I'd say a couple weeks to a month later, I go down and I first trained with him. And the thing of it was I was keeping up with those guys on some accessory stuff. So he thought, he knew those guys were stronger than me on max effort, but he didn't realize the work capacity I already had.
Right.
So we were doing like dumbbell fold-ins, right, on the ground. And we were using, or like kickbacks, and we were using like 75, 80-pound dumbbells. And I'm able to hang with these guys on this shit, right?
Right.
So he's like, this dude's got some balls. So long story short, he hands me a bunch of old Powerlifting USAs and copied articles, and I start reading them, and I'm getting really infatuated with this knowledge. And I take it to Dr. Kramer at Ball State, because I'm just starting school at the same time, and I throw it all to him, and I'm like, dude, do you see the crazy shit this guy's doing? This is insane. And he kind of starts chuckling, and I'm like, what's so funny? And he's like, he hands me this. So is it backwards? Or can you read it?
No, I can read it. Yeah.
So he hands me Vladimir Zatsiorsky's Science of Practice of Strength Training, and flips it to the page of like, I'd have to look and see, but it's like page 20 or page 30 or something. And he flips to this page and he starts showing me muscle types of resistances. They're talking about cords and shit and different kinds of cables and like strength curve, right?
Right.
Then it starts showing me like max effort method and dynamic method. And then I look at the cited articles in the book, 1960.
Right.
So it's from the Soviet Union in 1960. And he's like, dude, this shit ain't new. This is old. And I was like, no way. So he starts getting me all the old texts from Zatsiorsky himself. Wow. So Dr. Kramer was an associate professor with Vladimir Zatsiorsky at Penn State.
Wow.
So he calls over there and says, hey, I got this lifter kid that is really interested in the old Soviet texts. Can you send me over? So I was one of the first guys to have some of the original Verkhoshansky and Medvedev texts translated and sent over so I could actually read them.
Oh, that's awesome.
And then I'm seeing all these citations from like the 60s and 70s, and I'm like, holy shit, this stuff isn't new. But to me it was, right?
Right, yeah.
So that's when I really wanted to become a student of the game.
Oh, that's awesome.
And I remember, this is really fucked up. So when I was in school, obviously we had some of the best professors, but they were really high up in the classes. So like, if you were going to get Dr. Kramer, you at least had to be a senior. You know what I mean? Like you weren't going to take a base level class with Kramer. Yeah. So I had these base level course instructors, right? And I'm in the first like 200 level of strength conditioning, and we get this assignment to write a 1-week program. And I write this conjugate program with dynamics and max efforts and all this crazy shit. I get a fucking B on it. I get a B because it didn't follow the NSCA principles of how to train. Right. So I go and tell Kramer, and Kramer goes, who the fuck gave you a B on this? He looked at it and was like, 72-hour rule, like optimal volume for fucking like speed work. Like, dude, I figured it out. Right. And I was so pissed. I was almost in tears. I got a B on it because, I mean, I studied like 15 other books out of the classroom to learn how to do this. Right.
Yeah.
He goes to the associate professor that's under Kramer. He goes, "You're going to take that B away from Matt and give him an A+."
Wow.
And he goes, "What?" And he goes, "Do you realize that he has just basically learned how to do all the old Soviet concurrent conjugate training protocol? He gave it to you in a fucking low-level class. That guy had never even seen that shit before." And that's when I knew I was in deep trouble. You know what I mean? So
yeah, you stumbled on
so
that.
Kramer signed off. So Kramer goes, "Listen, I want you to, over this summer," this was like 2001. He goes, "I want you to design me 3 or 4 12-week programs of conjugate training for football, powerlifting, all kinds of stuff. And I want you to tell me why you're doing it. Show me how you're using chains, all these weight releasers." Because he was interested in it too, because he knew I was onto something. And then I was seeing what we were doing over at Louie's place, and I was emulating some of that and explaining, and then asking Louie and Chuck and George Halbert, like, "Why are we doing this?" And they would explain to me the force curve and increasing acceleration and all this other stuff. They let me. I never took another course again on program design at Ball State, because they passed me as a sophomore. I didn't have to take any junior or senior classes on program design. I was automatically given an A.
Wow, that's awesome.
Which was pretty awesome.
Yeah.
So they basically were letting me take graduate level courses, and I didn't realize why until the last year. Kramer comes up to me and goes, "I've been working on going to UConn for the last 3 years, and I wanted to make sure you were in some of my classes." So what he did was he stepped me up to the higher level graduate classes, and then let them pass for the undergraduate level classes, because he wanted me to have some connection with him before he left.
Right.
So he didn't know if the job was going to come that next year or the year after, but he was planning on moving to UConn. So he took me out of the small level classes and moved me up. So when I was supposed to be taking 100 and 200 level classes, I was in like 500 and 600 level classes for program design and exercise physiology and all this other stuff, because he knew that whoever was going to take his place wasn't him. You know what I mean? Mm-hmm. So he wanted me to have a lot of that knowledge. And then, so I was very fortunate to, but I mean, it all started from me bringing him papers that were way outside of the classroom, books that I was studying that he knew were available, but he didn't know that I knew they were around. And I was bringing them around and already trying to emulate that shit. So for him, it was like, holy shit, I found a prodigy. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I found a guy that not only wants to learn how to get strong, but he wants to do it too.
Right. And that's, I mean, that's something you and I talked about when I was at your gym recently too, was that difference. There's the learning, and then there's the doing, and then there's the rare person that kind of gets both, it's the Venn diagram, I guess. Yeah. But
it's not common.
No. And that's what's amazing too, that he also, I didn't really know that about Kramer. I didn't really know much about Kramer besides the famous things he wrote, but that's really interesting to hear that he was so, I don't want to say, I guess open-minded is the right word, but nurturing in that way too, that, he recognized right away.
I think he was the same way. He came from Wisconsin. Mm-hmm. He got his doctorate. He went to Penn State to work under Zatsiorsky. And I think what happened was he created an open mind, because Zatsiorsky blew his fucking doors off with knowledge.
Right.
Like, I think that Kramer probably went to Penn State thinking he knew quite a bit. And then once he went around Zatsiorsky, and Zatsiorsky started showing him all this Soviet training literature, I think he realized he didn't know shit. And it stepped him up, and it made him realize there was so much more to learn, and he kept learning. Versus boxing himself in and going, "I don't need to learn that. I'm already smart enough." See, that's how a lot of people do. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Well, it's interesting. Like, are you familiar with Dr. Alfredo Herrera, the weightlifting coach?
I've heard his name.
Yeah. So he was Cuban born in the USSR, and he was educated in Moscow with all the Soviet sports scientists, cosmonaut scientists, everyone else. And he worked with a lot of the weightlifting teams in the Soviet Union, I think in the 80s. And then later on in like the late 80s was, shipped back to Cuba to work with the Cuban national team in weightlifting. And this is all under the USSR, obviously. But he, got to train with all and learn from in these universities in Moscow from a lot of those great names, like while they were still in the Soviet Union. And and so Charles, I know, was a big fan of Herrera's, and like they knew each other when Charles was still alive. And last summer, it was really interesting though. So last summer I got to spend a weekend with him, and he only speaks Spanish. So it was, I had to have a translator. And he was talking about how, like, it was sort of the same story. It's like you'd bring something to him, like, hey, what do you think about training like this, X, Y, or Z? And he would laugh and he would say, let me see if I can find it. And he'd go on his laptop and he had all these old scanned papers from, you know, the 80s and 70s and whatever. And he was like, yeah, this was a study. We did this shit in 83. Yeah, here, I'll tell you right now, because we already did that study. Like whatever they're arguing about, like even a lot of the like optimal training volumes for hypertrophy, he was like, yeah, we did a lot of that. And then he was showing me like, yeah, they're probably going to find this, you know, and whatever. But yeah, but he was really interesting to learn from. I mean, he's still alive. He still writes a lot. It's in Spanish, so you have to get it translated. But it's really interesting though. He taught me a lot about, and the small group we were with, about the, like, a lot of the differences that he found between the Russian athletes and the Latin American athletes. The reason I was interested in it, I'm not a weightlifter, but was because it's a weight class sport and the body compositions are much more similar to fighting than, like, you know, maybe powerlifting, for example. And so a lot of what he taught me about, you know, management of, you know, health and whatnot for weight class sports was gold. You know, it was pretty cool. You know,
huge. I mean, especially when you're expending so much energy in a wrestling or fighting and you have to cut that amount of weight. I mean, it's one thing to cut water and cut all these electrolytes when you got to lift something for a short period of time. It's another thing when you do that and you got to do something for like 10 minutes straight.
Right. Exactly.
You know, like, it's crazy.
Yeah, no, definitely. So that was why I was interested in learning from him too, because he was somebody who, and it's interesting because, like, the Soviet Union and a lot of the, and you would know this much better, but, you know, a lot of the investment they had in sports science, you know, it's so far, it was for the time, it was so far ahead of, in some ways, where we're at now. And I feel like now maybe we're finally catching up a little bit, but now it's 2020.
Yeah. It's wild. I mean, the real reason that happened was because the Soviet Union had so much pride in their system, their communistic system and their state system, that they felt that the more medals that they won in the Olympics showed that their system was superior to a capitalistic system.
Right.
And so that's why they dumped so much money, time, and effort, is because they wanted to show on a world stage, look at us, we're more disciplined, we have our shit together better, and we can beat you in all these different things. So they looked at it as, we want more medals to show that our system's better than your system.
Right.
And that's what caused the state to want to dump so much time, money, effort, energy into the weightlifting and the things that had class sports, because there's multiple medals to be won, you know?
Yeah, exactly. I remember you mentioning that when I think last year at your bench seminar, which I found interesting too. Another thing, I remember one thing Alfredo Herrera said too, that he was like, you know, he's like, another reason we were able to do so much of that too is we had money and bodies. He's like, we'll never have, he said, no country ever in the world will have the resources we had to do like the thing we did, you know, and just carte blanche.
But if they would have, if the United States would have been able to take the Soviet control system and apply it here in the same time frame, we would have created better athletes because of our nutritional status. So basically, you know, pre-1955, everybody in America could eat and had decent money, and there was a lot less stress involved with life, versus the Soviets were doing this with people that were basically, you know, bums over here, and made them, hey, you want a nice place to stay that's warm and you can get 3 meals a day, come in and train with us, and if you're good enough, you can stay. And for a lot of people don't realize that the Soviet, you know, when it's a different thing when you want to go in and train because you don't want to go and live in a place that doesn't have any heat in the winter.
Yeah.
You know, like, they're just tougher. I mean, there's a different reason. Over here, we train because, we think it'd be cool to be stronger than the next guy. Over there, they're like, if I don't do well, I'm not going to be able to eat and not have a nice place to stay.
Right.
I mean, there's a big difference in drive with that, you know.
Absolutely.
It's more survival based.
100%. Yeah. Yeah, you can even listen to that on, I remember when Joe Rogan was interviewing Yoel Romero from the UFC, because he was a Cuban wrestler. And that's what he said, the same thing. He's like, you got to have double dinner if you were on the top team for wrestling. So he's like, of course, I just kept.
Yeah.
you know?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah. So that was pretty interesting, but yeah, pretty cool. But yeah, man, I know, I've kept you here for a while, so I really appreciate your time. I won't keep you any
Yeah,
longer.
no problem, man.
Yeah, dude, this
No
was a lot of
problem.
fun. I appreciate it. I appreciate you making time to do this. I know, you know, it's weird times. I had hoped to do this in person with you in a few months, but I was like, you know what? Now we're all quarantined. We might as well just do it over the.
Well, I mean, that's why I just don't turn down any podcasts right now, because I mean, I should be at the fire departments working with firemen right now, but like I said, they've canceled all that. I mean, they're still paying me, but I send them workouts online now, but it's crazy. So for me, my schedule is really good for doing podcasts the next couple of weeks, and I'm
Right.
getting a bunch of stuff done. I got a new manual coming out on. I got a vertical diet cookbook of things that I've been playing around with eating that makes it taste good and low calorie, and you know, so that way you can stick to the diet better. And then I've been working on an actual mini workout manual to raise work capacity and fix weaknesses.
Oh, great.
So
That's
on
awesome.
top of the normal workouts. So I've been hesitant to put that out because everybody wants to overdo that shit. But I'm hoping that if somebody reads this manual, they're going to understand the importance of mini workouts being very easy and more restorative in properties versus detrimental. So I've really been working on that, putting a lot of time into those things. So that this is kind of good for me in a certain sense that this quarantine is happening, because it's forcing me to get a lot of projects knocked out.
Yeah. No, I kind of felt the same way when because like New York, it kind of happened a week or so ahead of a lot of places that like the day I was like, oh, I have to close up the studio. Well, looks like I can hit this list. Now I have all these other things. So I felt like I haven't slowed down either. So I know that feeling.
Yeah, it's been about the same.
Yeah, that's awesome though about the vertical diet cookbook. Is that something you want to get out in the next few weeks or?
I'm going to try to have it done, I think, by the end of the week if I can.
Oh,
And
awesome.
mostly what I'm doing is I'm just showing products that I found that taste good that you can add into the ground beef, or you can substitute scallops for this, and how to cook it and what to cook it with that can give you some of the same benefits with having a little bit more variety. So it's not a huge conducive, like 300-page,
Right.
this is exactly what you're doing kind of book. It's just more, look, you need the vertical diet download. You need to read this and be familiar with it. Now, this is some of the tweaks that I've made for it.
Oh, that's awesome. That sounds really cool. And then I know you have the Patreon too that people can log on to if they want to get a more in-depth view on your training.
So the Patreon basically is a place that people can go and be a subscriber to that goes way more in-depth on knowledge. You get videos before we post them. You get workout samples. So on the top tiers of the Patreon, I'm literally writing down my workouts verbatim and posting them, showing the order and why, giving explanations of the exercises and why I selected this at what time. Showing at the top tiers, you guys get the Stand Efforting download is absolutely free, and you're getting the manuals in chapters every month, meaning that all the stuff that we charge for on the internet is stuff that you can have for free as a top tier member over time. And then we also have, they also get discounts on equipment. They get discounts on manuals if they want the whole manuals. And we also have an ATP Labs discount code that goes only to Patreon channel that is saving them. If you're a decent supplement taking type person, could save you upwards of $100 to $200 a month, being a $50 a month subscriber. Right. I mean, there's no downside to it, you know? So that's the big thing is I created the channel initially because I wanted to help kids like Trey and things like that and make them, if I have a kid and a parent that's worthy, you know, a lot of these kids that I train, some of them are very disabled.
Right.
And a lot of people don't realize that if you don't have kids or never had a kid with a medical problem, you probably wouldn't realize. But, you know, a kid with a brain tumor that gets that removed and then gets spinal fusions, you're talking hundreds of thousands of dollars. And these parents they're skimming by to try to make it. And I don't want to have to charge them to train these kids. Right. So I thought, well, what's a better way than to create a channel where people can pay me a small amount a month and ask me pretty much anything they want. And instead of me just answering stuff for free on Instagram, they can donate to the Patreon channel and help me train kids, you know?
Right. No, that's great. I remember when you told me about that. I thought that was, yeah, it's beautiful. That's awesome. Yeah.
Yeah. So it's a way to try to give back, you know, try to help other people that may be less fortunate. And I think the problem that we have as athletes is that we look at ourselves, we're so locked in. We don't realize how fortunate we are to not have a medical problem or not have a real disability that allows us not to do or achieve things that we probably may want to achieve. And that's, to me, I want to try to get Trey and other kids at least as good as I can get them, you know, and do that based on the fact that other healthy people that want information that I bled for, they can do that for a small amount of month. You know what I mean?
Right. And help someone else out in the process. That's awesome. That's great.
Exactly.
Definitely. Awesome, man. So do you have anything else you wanted to say or plug while we're still on air?
No, I think that's awesome, man. I'm just glad that we're finally hopefully get some good fighters on here to listen to this stuff. I think there's a lot of valuable information on working your weaknesses and understanding that everything's a 23-hour, 24-hour day process.
Definitely.
You know, and a lot of times the big thing is for fighters and other athletes, sometimes and often most times, the real secret to you progressing and getting better is not in the facility, it's outside the facility. What you're eating, how you're sleeping, the stresses that you're staying away from, those are going to be the things that actually make you shine.
Absolutely. No, that's very well said. I know a lot of guys who listen to this are from, you know, a lot of it's regional too. So I know a lot of their coaches, so they're getting great coaching. So it's really all about not falling apart in those other 23 hours. So I think we can definitely end on that. So Matt, thank you very much for being here.
All right, man. We'll see you.
Definitely. Yeah. So you guys can check out mattwinningstrength.com. Is that right?
Yep.
Perfect. Yeah. And
then winningstrength.com. Yeah, Real Matt Winning on Instagram.
Perfect. Great, Matt. Well, thanks, dude.